Hello, good morning, and a very warm welcome to you the fourth edition of our Education 2021 webinar series. We're delighted to see so many of you here, so many familiar faces, but wherever you are today, you're very, very welcome, and thank you for taking the time to join us this morning for this wonderful seminar. I am delighted to have such a wonderful panel with me here this morning, and I'd like to introduce them to you. Firstly, from Jordan, Dima Bibi, who is the Chief Executive of INJAZ, an NGO in Jordan. She has a lot of diverse experience in areas of youth and women empowerment. And we're looking forward to her contribution in today's subject of Education 4.0. Secondly, from Singapore, we have Dr. Rani Birchmore, who works at Microsoft Corporation and looks after the strategy programs for K-12 in the Asia Pacific region. She works with a lot of ministries of education and looks at the transformation and the part technology plays in there. And again, I think we'll have a lot of contribution from her around this topic of Education 4.0. And finally, from the UK Department of International Trade, we're delighted to welcome Vipul Bhargava, who has been a special advisor and is a special advisor in education technology to the Department of International Trade. The department basically looks at the export drive of the UK and champions free trade, and that looks at investment, and so his contribution will be equally valuable. Today's webinar is sponsored by our partners in the Philippines, Redenta, our partners in Nigeria, Dynamis, in Zimbabwe, Conceptarian Works, and in Sri Lanka, EWIS. So thank you all so much for your partnership and sponsorship for this webinar. And I just want to tell you a little bit about Learning Possibilities. We're hosting this webinar. We're a global edtech company working in government and schools in the UK, Middle East, Africa, and Asia, looking at infrastructure, school readiness, identity management, and learning platforms. And through this webinar, you will see our website details appearing at the bottom. Please feel free to have a look at the work that we do. So coming on to the webinar today, we're going to be discussing Education 4.0 and its importance to schooling as it is today. We know that when we look at all industries, even those of construction, logistics, manufacturing, we're beginning to see the change and transformation with automation, robotics, virtualization, networks, all of these things coming in. And therefore, these industries are changing the way that they operate. Now, when we look at especially developing countries, it's important to bring this sort of technology and industry in because we know that it brings in better profits, higher margin, regenerates growth. And in this time of pandemic, these are all very valuable things. So today we're going to explore how we should prepare for Education 4.0. There will be a white paper produced at the end of this webinar. If you have registered, either on LinkedIn or sent us an email, you'll automatically be sent one. If you haven't, the email will appear at the bottom of the screen shortly. Please send us an email and we will make sure that you are registered for this. So can I start with Vipul today? And Vipul, what's your understanding of Education 4.0 and why do you think we need this reform at this point?
Thanks, Mel, and welcome everybody. Mel, thanks for having me here. Look, this is it's absolutely a critical topic that we're talking about today, and maybe sort of the scene by quoting an American philosopher, and I think they said really resonates with what we're talking about. He said, if we teach today's students as we taught yesterday's, we rob them of tomorrow. And so what we're really talking about in Education 4.0 is how do we prepare the students of today for a workforce for tomorrow? That's really the crux of it. Now, as you correctly said, Mehul, there are a lot of changes in technology all around us, and we sort of see it on a day-to-day basis. You go to a Marks and Spencer and you see fewer and fewer checkout counters. It's more automated. You go to Heathrow and you sort of see less and less people there. So you go to a warehouse and you see more and more robots. So we've sort of seen it all around us. But that's only sort of the tip of the iceberg, right? There's a lot more coming. That together is called the fourth industrial revolution. So the fourth industrial revolution is coming. We can see it coming to an extent, and some we can't see. So Education 4.0 is about how do we prepare students of today for something that we can see a little bit but can't see a lot of. There's a great book which I read some time ago called Rise of Robots by Martin Ford. And he talks about the kinds of jobs that are under threat. Mehul, you of course correctly said manufacturing, construction. I've talked a bit about retail. But we're looking at a world where even things like journalism, art, that is increasingly being done by robots, right? So, we've all talked about, autonomous driving, etc. But there will be jobs that we think won't be done by robots. They probably will be. So how do we prepare a workforce for that, right? And why are we talking about it today? Because we talk about it today because everyone's talking about jobs that don't exist today. I've heard this many times. 30% of jobs don't exist today. It's a number, right? We don't know what the number is. But not only are we talking about jobs that don't exist today, we're also not teaching the skills that are required for jobs that don't exist. So if I repeat that again, we don't know the skills that are required for the jobs we don't know that will exist. So there's an unknown in an unknown, right? So Education 4.0, according to me, is the alignment of education with the rapid changes of technology of the fourth industrial revolution. It's about changing two things: what we learn and how we learn. So why don't I just pause there for a second? But that to me is how I define Education 4.0, Mehul.
That's really interesting, and especially the piece about what we learn and how we learn. So what are you thinking that the outcomes and competencies should be with this? What are we seeking out of this workforce?
Let me start by actually answering the question, why do we need this in the first place, right? Of course, we said we need to prepare the workforce, but let's break it down, right? And so, it's about the increasing use of technology within education, right? At the heart of it, right? If technology that's going to change the industrial revolution, technology will also change education, right? So let's break it down with the stakeholders, right? So first is the perspective of students, right? From a student perspective, how do we prepare them for a future that is financially viable? We're not preparing them for jobs that don't exist. How do we personalize education so that nobody gets left behind? Of course, people will be left behind, but the inequity in education, which we're going to talk about later, how do you reduce that, right? How do we change the way children learn for better outcomes, better learning, faster recall, increased engagement, right? So I remember when I was in school, there were 40 of us in a class, one teacher. Some got it, some didn't get it. So we left students behind along that journey. Technology can help us avoid that problem, right? Also, Education 4.0 is about placing the student at the heart of the learning, right? It makes learning accessible from anywhere. There is increased communication with all the stakeholders, teachers, parents, etc. And it changes the way we assess students. Assessment changes. We're not unfairly assessing children based on the way they learn. So that's from the perspective of students. From the perspective of teachers, right? If you think about it, right, it sort of allows teachers to teach sort of slightly higher order thinking tasks, because hopefully technology can take away some of the mundane tasks that teachers find themselves in. The old our old Secretary of State, is always championing reduction of teacher workload, and I think that's critical. We'll talk about it later as well, but I think UNESCO came up with a number that there are going to be 60 million shortage of teachers, right? How are we going to get teachers? So if it's a rare commodity, right? If it's so rare, then how do we take away some of the mundane tasks for teachers so that they can do their job effectively? So we've talked about students, we've talked about teachers. From the perspective of companies, and I think this is critical, Mehul, how do we create, again, we talked about a workforce, but that is ready for these jobs. So if I'm a company, how do I get this talent that is ready for the jobs that I need them to do? An interesting number for you, Mehul, is the $16 billion in venture capital that went into education in 2020. That's the highest it's ever been, right? It's more than 2018 and 19 combined, right? Which is not surprising given COVID. Of the 16 billion, 48% went into workforce education. That number was minuscule 10 years ago, right? So companies feel the need to retrain their workforce, so much so that half of the global venture capital is going into it. So there's obviously a problem in the students or the people who are going into the workforce today. So how do we avoid that problem in the future? So that's from the perspective of companies. Finally, from the government perspective, I think every government is going to think about this. You need to ensure lower unemployment, of course, because otherwise that leads to different issues, especially the emerging markets, which you talked about, Mehul, or a young workforce. How do you make sure that there is enough employment for them going into the future, which ensures that there's prosperity of citizens, and it's not just concentrated in a few. There's greater prosperity, which eventually bridges the inequity in society. So again, I'm mindful that I've waffled for a while, Mehul, but hopefully I just want to lay out why we think education is important.
So, two quick questions on that, Vipul. I mean, when we're thinking about preparing people, are we thinking about digital skills, interpersonal skills, analytical skills, or all of these?
I think it's all of these, and I don't think that's all three were important even in the past. When we were in school, I think the proportion is probably changing a little bit, right? So we increasingly find that the softer skills are going to get more and more important. So think about what we're going to do is we're going to be competing with robots, right? In some sense, right? So, and they're increasingly are going to be able to do jobs that humans did. So how can we outcompete, right? So we talk about softer skills, critical thinking, which become even more important, right? So it's a mix of everything with a few other skills.
That's you and I were both at school, I think, quite a long time ago. But the big difference between then and now was that even if you didn't have those skills, you could actually get through the school system because it relied on so much face-to-face teaching and books and so on. My worry is that, trying to prepare schools for education 4.0, the inequity gap, the inadequacy gap, aren't we just going to make this so much bigger?
And that's the biggest threat, Mehul, right? So as with anything, there are opportunities and threats, right? And I think opportunities are what we've talked about, right? Creating the workforce, etc. But the threat of inequity is probably one of the greatest that we face today. I think in the past I've called it the sort of climate crisis of education. It's something which we know is coming, but if we don't act now, it'll become massive. So you're absolutely right? But I also feel that there's an opportunity to bridge that inequity. And this is where the role of government is going to be so critical to get the infrastructure ready. Because, we're talking technology. Technology can only as good as this infrastructure in the first place, right? We're still in 2021 and we're talking about not having enough fast internet, broadband in certain places, right? We're still at that level. So we just solve that really quickly before we can democratize education.
And I guess one of the biggest challenges that we face is how do we prepare teachers to be able to deliver this sort of curriculum, deliver digital interpersonal analytical skills, build them into the knowledge-based curriculum that we have to deliver, perhaps do it over technology, which we have seen over the past year. So big questions, big gaps. And if I can come on to you, Rani, I mean, what are your thoughts as somebody who works for Microsoft and works with ministries, drives teacher training programs? Where are the gaps today?
Great question, and Vipul, some great insights in what you mentioned there. So I would really love to circle back on some of those points. Dr. Mahul, we are all grappling with the urgent issues of raising achievement and reducing disparity in education. And as educators, I'm a privileged educator. We expect to be more successful in improving the outcomes for all students. Now, we know we need to get better at evaluating the impact and what we do individually and collectively. And smarter as you get smarter in using research that can tell us about how to work with diverse students and different contexts. Now, I want to say before I go on as well, a big thank you to all of the educators, because the last year has really challenged us in what we could address for the teachers and their learning themselves, let alone their students, that their charges who they've had to focus on. Teachers are facing currently a formidable challenge, whether educating students in a masked up environment, or a socially distancing classrooms, or doing that virtually without actually being present from computer screens. So yeah, there is a huge need for us to rethink what are the student needs, and then rethinking what is it that in teacher development, in the teacher qualifications, in the skills that there are gaps, and there are many. Outside of the fundamentals of teaching, there is an urgent need, and we are seeing, teachers needing to be equipped, and educators needing to be equipped with tools that increases the effectiveness in managing a holistic child. To what Vipul was mentioning earlier, because the needs of how a day-to-day environment for the teacher to equip the children with the needs for jobs that doesn't exist yet, and bring the learning for jobs that are in an evolutionary process of being redundant or not being an assistant or evolving to something else. So all of these needs that the students have, the teachers need to learn how to equip them in every subject, in every class, and together with that, the emotional and social needs that has risen as a responsibility for the teacher today. So there are many gaps, and the other big gap that we have is we've been able to get students and teachers online without necessarily very large long-term process. It all happens so fast. And what that meant is there are gaps in how do we take care of the children in a cyber environment? What's happening to the wellness? How safe is it in the interactions and the environments online? So there are gaps that, fundamentally the teachers are left to deal with. Because when you bring an environment where there's a 19-year-old or an 18-year-old and a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old, there's duty of care that is required from the system. So there are many gaps like that. But I think fundamentally, going back to what Vipul said, the holistic nature, the skills that we need to develop for students to equip themselves is going to come from the teacher. So I think that is going to be a critical factor for us. How do we equip the teachers with the skills? And we are doing that. We are seeing many countries do that, and they are on their journey. already, and I think that's really heartwarming. But there's a lot more work to be done. We are still at the very beginning. The other point that Vipul made was about systems and tools. Um, we really do need enterprise grade systems and tools in education. We are becoming very, very clear that because of all of these different needs and going into blended and hybrid learning, the tools that are required for the teachers to do their day-to-day jobs in trying to address that 1 to 40 ratio, 1 to 10, and in some cases even more than that, technology is going to be becoming that we've got no choice. Technology needs to be that tool that we use to help the teachers with the right data, with the right resources, so that they can do their job of giving as much personalization as they can in these various structures and environments that is a classroom in inverted commas, because the learning environment that we traditionally call a classroom is so varied. So yeah.
Just to pick up on that, Rani, I mean, when we think about teachers traditionally, we think about these, fonts of wisdom, people who spend years studying a subject, have become experts, and are now teaching us. And does that mean that we're now expecting them, apart from the subject that they teach, to become equally expert in digital skills, in giving interpersonal skills, in being analytical, critical thinking skills? Are we just asking too much?
Yeah, good question. The question makes me think of a quote that I always remember. Let technology teach the masses, and I'll be here as an educator to bring context and concept to that knowledge. So I think to Vipul's point about what machines can do and what human beings can do, I think you're right. We are asking a hell of a lot from the teacher, and it's not sustainable. The numbers that was mentioned of having a teacher crunch, not having enough teachers, let alone teachers that we are investing in to be able to traverse all of these different challenges that is happening as we go. So it is going to be tough. And to answer your question, we are going to need to help teachers with data, with technology, and also the learning, not in the traditional way we talk about. We talk about learning, and everyone goes really deep in all of the learning fundamentals when it comes to students, but I feel like a lot of the times we forget that teachers are the students, and the multiplier effect of teaching those students is going to be really important. And the enterprise systems are going to need to come in place to manage that, to help them. So they are doing more of providing context, concept, inquiry-based skills that they can deploy on children. And technology can provide a phone, a laptop, the web, all of these tools, the content repositories, they are going to take care of the knowledge base, whilst we need to use the teacher's human competencies. And we're only going to be able to do that with proper implementation of technology, I think.
So that brings me to my next point, which, and I do agree, we need to look at what we teach, we need to look at pedagogy, we need to look at the skills we're giving children today, because tomorrow is not as certain as it was perhaps when I grew up. So, but the question here is this, that, we see so many children still out of school, we see so many schools that don't have teachers or adequate numbers of teachers. So what are the changes that we need in the classroom to deliver this? Are we talking about every classroom being fully digital? Are we talking about access to a device at some point? Are we talking about automating teaching? What are the changes that we're thinking about here?
I think it's a little bit of everything that you just mentioned. A blended learning, everyone's got different definitions, but a blended learning intrinsically means that you have your traditional component of teaching for certain subjects and certain students, and you have an hybrid environment where there's synchronous learning happening for people from different areas and different locations at the same time. There is TV broadcast that is happening in a lot of countries to reach those who are challenged with access and equity. So to answer your question, it needs to be all of those things, but delivered in a structured manner so that we are collecting as much of that information as possible to deliver personalized learning as much as we can for the student. And that personalized learning looks very different depending on the age of the student. In university, it's very empowered by the student themselves. In K to 12, we still require an environment where we are bringing in the different stakeholders that are underpinning the students' development, including parents and teachers and the teacher community and other teachers, and coming together as student groups to do explorative learning themselves. So it's all of the above, Maho. And I think every country is at a different stage of development and in that adoption or transformation cycle. So they will need to sit back and think outside the box and bring all of those together in a way that the teacher in the classroom is able to give their undivided attention for the learning outcomes of a student holistically.
I think the comment that came up on screen just now was quite interesting from South Yorkshire, which is in the northern part of England. And perhaps sometimes we, generally classify everything as being developed and undeveloped. And yet, here is a teacher from a school in England saying, I'm in a deprived part of the country and only have 5 working laptops. So this challenge is, I think, is perhaps much bigger than we think it is. And from that, I guess the question here is, beyond the content and the delivery of the content, what else is it that we need? And let me ask Dima that question. Hi, Dima.
Hi, Mehul. Thank you so much. Always lovely to be with all of you. So yes, beyond content and delivery, education reform, I would say, is a very complex process, where we really need to think not only outside the box, which is, in this case, maybe the course, the topic, but outside the building, outside the school, outside the institution, the education institution. Such process needs to be tackled through a multi-level approach or multi-layer approach, where factors in every approach should be examined. We should look at the gaps, what's limiting us here. We should look at opportunities within each level. And just to talk a little bit more about that, just to explain it further. So take the first, if you want, level of analysis, the course itself. We need to, what are the factors there? The course outline, the content, what lens are we using when we're developing the content, the delivery methods, the assessment of the course, the teacher's tools, the manuals, etc. So we need to look into all of that. Where are we going wrong? What should we need to change? What opportunities do we have? Then we go to the second level of analysis, the school itself, the leadership of the school. And that I cannot explain how important leadership of the school is. And at Injaz, we have a lot of experience in that. We noticed that schools with very engaged and active and passionate school managers, for example, do much, much better than other schools, given all other factors are the same. So leadership, and it's as very well said, zoom out from the strategy, zoom into the person. We look at the teachers' training within the school, the communication across the different functions in the school, the setup of the classroom, the facilities, the monitoring and evaluation, etc. Then we go to the third level of analysis, the institution, the Ministry of Education itself, the commitment at the highest level, the ownership. We need to look at it from a system approach. Is there a function, a unit that is responsible for the competencies that we, like when we want to address, for example, inclusivity? Are there experts there? Is there a function that looks after that? Do we have the right support for schools? Do we have the right governance in place? Does the education system have the right structure? Is it too decentralized? Is it too centralized? The rewards and incentives, etc. And then the largest, the last, I would say, unit of analysis, the ecosystem, the stakeholders, the players, all involved, the infrastructure. We need to look what is limiting us within the ecosystem. Is it the lack of support services, lack of labs, innovation centers, clubs? Is it the legal framework? Is it the culture? Lots of resistance, and so on and so forth. So just it's a very complex, as I said, process, and we really need to. It cannot be tackled by just looking at the course and content.
Do you actually think that this is therefore something for ministries as opposed to schools? It's about frameworks and governance and vision at a higher level that understands this and understands this process, because far too often I see that education is seen about sort of building schools and perhaps increasing the number of places for teacher training, and is that what we need, a bigger vision than this?
I mean, we need, as I was saying, we need to look into all these factors affecting the whole process of education. We need to look at assessment. Assessment is extremely important. I mean, it is definitely a main catalyst in this challenge. If we change everything that I'm talking about, the content, the delivery, but we keep the assessment the way it is, we continue to measure the students' ability to memorize, we continue to expect that all students have the same abilities and the same conditions and circumstances, then we will continue to operate factory schools. And we will continue to produce graduates that, have skill set that fit the second industrial revolution. So it must also transform. So all the different elements, whether the assessment, the content, the lens we're using, the teachers' training, they all need to transform. They all need to take into consideration also the individual differences. Not everything is right or wrong. There's a lot of shades of gray, and the student's perspective, we should look at it as an enrichment to the process of learning. We should look at ourselves, educators, as also learners. We should also consider how to instill concepts we talk about. How do we instill the concept of innovation? We need to work on our own mind fixedness, our structural fixedness, and relational fixedness, and functional fixedness. So shifting focus from, I would say, shifting focus from teaching to learning does shift all elements, specifically assessment and others, from one that is also only decided by the teacher and the education system and the educators, to one that involves the student's perspective, the student's preferences. So yeah, lots of factors to take into consideration.
So by changing what we measure, what you're saying is that the system will then change because the exam, the assessment has changed, and therefore they'll need to be able to prepare students for that. But what I wonder about with that is, when we think about some of these digital skills, interpersonal skills, analytical skills, isn't that where the problem is? That either we ask teachers to assess these, and in which case it's very subjective, or we need complex digital technology, which is elusive. And isn't that where part of the problem is?
Well, yes, absolutely. We need to. Well, okay. So I think, Mehul, the one thing we need to, and Vipul has addressed that. The one thing we need to understand that there is no specific, clear, logical framework for Education 4.0. There's no specific learning framework there. There are core elements. There's a roadmap. Core elements include exploratory education. So project-based, application-based, research-based education, opening spaces for trial and error. Lifelong learning is another important element. So we all talk about lifelong learning, and my understanding of lifelong learning is really two things. It is learning how to learn and enjoying the process and wanting to do more throughout your lifetime of this process of learning. Individualized education, and Rani has addressed that. So taking into consideration the individual abilities and interests, education also being a seamless environment, education anywhere, education anytime, open distance. The open access is a key element. The integration, and that's on your point, Mehul, the integration of digital technologies is a core factor. It's not the only thing about Education 4.0. It's not only about technology. And it's not only about preparing students to the workforce. And one of the comments that just came on the chat a few minutes ago was on that. Yes, absolutely. It's not just about preparing young people to the job market. It's preparing them for life. A lot of focus on their emotional skills and psychological well-being and cognitive and social skills, etc. So it's competencies driven rather than knowledge and information driven. And the fact that it is inclusive as well. And I hope and wish that inclusivity is not taken away from the reform process towards Education 4.0, because I really believe that this is our chance to really introduce inclusive education, making sure that the reform very much takes into consideration inclusivity, whether we're talking about gender or location related or abilities, whatever it is, just to make sure that we are being inclusive.
And that's a very, very good point. So my question is, when we know that there is inequity, there is massive gaps in terms of availability of technology, connectivity, all of these things, how do we address inclusivity?
Yeah. So my understanding of inclusivity in education is about fairness, not just about equality, but about equity, meaning being fair and not just being even in distributing resources. And the reason is that to be inclusive, education needs to consider individuals and groups of people with different backgrounds, different needs, different resources, different conditions and circumstances at home, different level of education at their families, etc. So addressing inclusivity requires integration of the concept within the different levels that I just talked about. For example, when we talk about, when we're developing the course content, for example, the exercises, one needs to look at this from a gender lens. It needs to take into consideration students with certain disabilities, dyslexic students, and there are many, those who have hyperactivity, those who are in underserved communities and underserved areas. If you look at the second level of analysis, the school, we need to look at accessibility. Is it friendly for people with, on wheelchairs or who are visually impaired? Are teachers trained on the concept of inclusion? Are facilities and labs and computers take into consideration the different abilities, etc.? The education system as a whole, when it develops its strategies and plans, it needs to integrate the concept throughout their strategies and plans. It needs to have experts within the system, the ecosystem as well. When the government plans for budgets, for example, and infrastructure, it needs to look at the underserved community. There has to be support services there, centers, clubs, etc. So yeah, inclusivity in education is beyond all that. It's where we really instill among children very important values of fairness, justice, positive engagement, positive participation, respect, empathy, and many other values that I believe are equally important, if not even more important than the skills and the knowledge that we want them to gain.
Yeah, excellent. I also agree with you. But what comes to my mind from what you've said, initially about, looking at what we need beyond content and delivery, the framework, inclusivity. I mean, in some ways, all of this is pointing to, whether the current concept of schooling is now out of date, and do we need to think about redefining it?
I mean, all these, what everyone has been saying, it's all about redefining really the concept of schooling. It's all about redefining the concept of schooling. It has to be a much more interesting to start with, and that's something we know by now. Our children, there are many stimulating things around them. You cannot attract their attention for 2 minutes through a lecture. Needs to be very engaging. It needs to be very relevant. It needs to be quite. They need to feel that the skills that they're getting is helping them in their daily lives. And like when we integrated financial education and entrepreneurship education within the public school system in Jordan, immediately we could feel the difference. Immediately students could feel the difference. Parents, I would get phone calls from parents saying, thank you, we finally have something that's quite relevant to everyday's life. They understand how to budget, they understand how to plan for their life, they understand what's very important and necessary and what's an accessory, and how to save, etc. So yes, it is quite transformative in every way, but it's not. I mean, having said all that, and yes, we've been saying this is a very complex process and all that, but it's not, as they say, it's not chemistry. It's not impossible. It's not too hard. It's doable. It just needs the right people on board. It needs a cross-sectoral and multi-stakeholder coalitions to work on it. It cannot be done with all the respect in the world for educators. Alone, they cannot do it, because you need the employer, you need the person who understands psychology, you need the person who understands technology, you need the person who, you need a lot of sectors to be engaged in the process of designing or reforming education.
I think that's right, very and very valuable. So I guess what comes out of the discussions we've had, and Vipul, for you, is this question that is the catalyst for all of this changing the exam system. Is that the the key thing we need to do in order to drive this change, or is industry itself enough of a catalyst to change education?
First of all, Ryan, Dima, I think it's been a fascinating discussion. So thank you for your insights. Mel, to answer your question, I think yes, the way we assess students today fundamentally needs to change. But I think assessment is almost the end goal of what we're doing currently, right? So we sort of teach a bunch of things and we assess them, right? So I think yes, assessment needs to change, but also what we're teaching along the way. That I think will be the catalyst for change. I think Dima very correctly said, right? It's about what we're teaching that needs to change, and then of course everything else sort of flows from there, right? Once we change what we teach, we figure out how to assess. Right now, as I brought up, we don't know what to teach currently. Yes, we've got life skills. We have some sense, right? But we're still figuring it out. If we don't know what to teach, how do we know what to assess, right? So I think that's why almost the initial focus for me is that we need to first decide what we're going to teach, life skill, etc., and then we assess. But assessment also needs to be continual. This whole sort of summative assessment in the end, I don't think that sort of works. Also, assessment can also be personalized, right? So far, we give one test for everybody, and we just test everybody on that parameter. But assessment can also be individualized.
And just picking up on that, Dima, when you think about current assessment, there are standard exams. If you think of, the British GCSEs or A levels or the baccalaureates, or they're standardized exams that everybody in the world does. They, teach a curriculum. Everybody does the same exams, but we know economies are different. The developing world and the emerging world and the developed world are different. Are we now talking about, looking at teaching differently in different parts of the world and, focusing on different areas? Is that what this may end up being?
That's a good question, Mehul, and I see that discussion happening in every discussion on whether on education, but on education in specific. How local should we be? How global should we be? Should we follow global competencies that standards, or should we develop our own national framework? And this is a debate. And you have, as we speak, we are sitting in discussion tables with decision makers that have very different opinions on that regard. So some think that why should we reinvent the wheel? But I'm one of those people who, the world is only getting smaller, and we are really preparing a global citizen. So we need to, act local, definitely, but we need to think global and then act local. And let's make use of what's out there. While others keep, insisting that, no, we need to develop everything locally. We need to of course, we need to be respectful to the culture. We need to be considerate to our own circumstances. We need to look at our own gaps and needs. But I think we need to just push ourselves further towards what's out there, what's happening, what a global citizen looks like, what is a successful, happy citizen looks like, and base our learning based on that.
And just thinking a little bit further on that, Rani, one of the reasons things perhaps are standardized is because in many ways people look at schools as a stepping stone to get into university. Yet we know that less than 10% of students go to university. So how should we be preparing the rest?
Great question, Mehul. I want to just address one thing that Dima just mentioned about how do we get the skills, how national or global is learning. In higher education, for the longest time, it is a accepted practice to have skill-based and knowledge-based specialists to be brought in across borders. Universities has been doing this for years, where they need a subject matter expert for their lessons. Either they pull them in, virtually or in person to come and provide context and concepts and that skill set and that learning for that competency to students. So I just want to address, I think we already see lots of good examples of that happening. But in K to 12, that is not very, you don't see that as much as you see in higher ed. And I think that tells us that that is very possible. It is very possible for us to, as we look at the global environment and where naturally there are some expertise that are in high supply in some countries and not others. So there is a golden opportunity to actually leverage that and increase the competency levels where there is a desire to increase. So that I want to address. Going back to your point about the question you asked, and I think, you know what, there is so many things that we can do, and we think about. Industry traditionally invest quite a lot for work-based investment for higher ed. So because we want graduates to come out and we want them to go into work and be gainfully employed, and there is a vested interest for the commercial organizations to make sure that they are creating content and they're creating skill sets and they're creating certification, and they do quite a lot of that for students who are coming out of higher education. And to your point, a lot of students in a lot of countries go directly to employment after year 10, some even before that, which is not necessarily ideal, but that's the reality. And a lot of them go after college, they go straight into, or in some countries we call higher school, and they go straight into workforce. And majority of our SMB industry segment is needing skills from these group of students who are coming out straight into the workforce without going into a university for any sort of personalized or specialized learning. So what do we do for skills for them? Going back to Vipul's point, a lot at that point in time, they haven't done any specialization. So if they seek specialization, they're going into vocational learning somewhere, or they are doing learning that is available from them from the private industry themselves. So what can we do to equip these students to come out and be ready for employment? It goes back to what our guest speakers, both Dima, you, and Vipul said. The skills that is required with interpersonal skills, analytical skills, all of those bases of them being productive and being able to think outside the box and problem solve, and all of those skills we need to give these students much earlier than we do today in a structured manner, in a structured environment. How do you work in teams? How do you work to an outcome? How do you work in a project? How do you build your capacity and your tenacity and have grit and resilience to see through problems to an end? All of these skills are highly, highly required by our employers. How do you multitask? How do you take care of many things in an SMB environment? So those are definitely skills that we are seeing more and more, by the way, that curriculum changes that is happening and is being provided. Today, majority of it is being provided by external outside of the school environment. But we are seeing more and more the requirement for this coming from ministries to us. So we are building the framework for that to happen. In Microsoft, for example, we've got what we call the MS Learn. And here you go in and you get foundational skills that are applicable across industry, all the way to deep skills that are applicable on a role-based skill set training and acquisition. So there's quite a lot that is already happening. So there's not all doom and gloom, which is great. And I think that's what the COVID and the pandemic has done. It has made governments re-look at it. Is it going at faster pace as we want? No, because we are trying to go against what is systemic in ministries for the longest time, and it's procurement processes, it's approval processes, it's frameworks, it's all of this has to come together. But the good news is it is happening. For me, in the last 2 weeks, I have been involved in about 7 countries looking at redesigning their curriculum, putting together how do we give these teachers in a country, educators in a country, who then serve it up to the students, curriculum that is not traditional, content that is created by teachers, content that is being created by students, content that is being created in the huge World Wide Web, and content that is being created by learning designers within the framework. We are seeing that. And I think that's really heartwarming for us to see.
So, Vipul, just picking up on that point, what Rani seems to be saying is that schools need to give students, learners, the skills that they need, because those are the skills that industry is looking for and values. So I guess my question is, what role should industry be playing in schools? Because today you see very little of that. I mean, you see some of it in universities, but if 90% of the learners don't go to university, shouldn't industry be playing a much larger role in schooling our children?
I think it's a great point, and I think we will see more and more of that. Right? We already see, we see a lot of industries, especially starting largely with the tech industry. Right? You see the Googles and the Facebooks of the world who are getting more and more involved at the university level, and now at the school level with coding. I mean, coding has become huge in the last 5 years, right? And we're starting to see. Sorry, I should mention Microsoft as well, not just Google and Facebook. Give me a run here, right? But we see education, is almost becoming a part of what these organizations are doing, right? So I remember when I started at university, I think Microsoft did a wonderful job with the whole Microsoft certification programs, etc. Right? So we saw. I mean, this has been going on for a while, where a lot of industries have been focused on education, and I think they'll gradually come down to the school level as well. The one thing I do want to pick up here, though, is which we haven't quite touched upon just as yet, is we're talking about learning, but I think Deepa mentioned this a little bit. Is also about unlearning and relearning, right? I think it's another one of those skills that we need to make sure that children can. I learned this today. How do I unlearn? Something's changed. How do I unlearn and I relearn again? Traditionally, we've said education stops, work starts. That model needs to be sort of relooked at of this lifelong, which I think again Deepa mentioned. The other risk I want to talk about, because we have to talk about what we need to do. One of the risks I want to bring up is, as we see technology come in, one of the risks is that who's building the technology? We humans. We have a lot of human biases. The risk we have is that we transfer the human bias to the machines. How do we ensure that that doesn't happen? So, we're building AI. AI is built on what humans are building. So how do we not translate? Initially, it's bound to happen. We're bound to have human biases in in AI. So how do we make sure that happens less, but two, we're cognizant of that?
It's interesting what you say. I mean, recently we were involved in a hackathon project for girls with Microsoft, focused on coding and AI, some of the things you mentioned. And one of the things that came out of this was that there are still in many countries prejudices about what occupations are for boys and what are for girls. maybe a question for you, Dima. How do we, when we talk about inclusivity, how do we make these career options, open to girls or encourage girls to move into these sorts of career options?
Well, I mean, it starts with the mindset. It starts with raising awareness, with believing, to start with, that this is the case. Girls can work in anything they wish or desire or have interest to work in. And the role of teachers here is very, very important. One reason why I think we're slower than we should is that, and Rani touched upon that, is that and this is where the role of higher education, we were just talking about the higher education and universities. I think the most important role for higher education now is to prepare teachers, because suddenly we're asking a teacher who was a lecturer to become a facilitator, who was the source of information to be the source of inspiration. Traditional teacher now should need to be a researcher, someone who understands in lots of issues and development. He's a learner or she's a learner. They are partners. They used to work with blackboards or green boards and chalks, and now they're technology users. So that's the teacher and the mindset of the teacher, whether concepts of inclusivity, gender-related concepts, I think we need to focus on the teacher. Yes, the education system is changing, where the relationship is not just a direct relationship between the student and the teacher. The student now is in the center of a networked, much more networked approach, having lots of different sources of knowledge and information. But this relationship, I believe, remains to be essential. I really don't think the teacher's role is any less. On the contrary, it has become much more crucial to the development of the students. So on your point, Mihol, whether it's inclusivity or whatever other core elements and concepts and competencies we wish to, we aim for, I believe it needs to start with working on the teacher through higher education or colleges, training, upskilling, and so on and so forth.
And I have to say, I think both you and Rani are great role models in this aspect. And, I really do hope it inspires so many others to, take career paths that perhaps have traditionally been seen as those for men. So I'm going to put you all on the spot now, because I see that, there are a lot of teachers in the chat and registered for this event. So what I want to ask you, from your experience and from what you see, if I'm a teacher today in a school, what should I be doing practically over the next 12 months to try and prepare my students in the way we've talked about? We've talked about skills, we've talked about, the way that they learn, teaching them how to learn or learning to learn, and so on. How do we do that, given that schools might have currently, issues with number of teachers, the amount of technology, the exam system not being correct? Given those factors, which aren't going to change overnight, what can we do today and over the next 12 months to, start down this path? And let me start with you, Vipul.
Sure. Thanks, Mel. And you're right, it does put us on the spot here, given how many teachers we've got. But I think, look, I think, if I look back at which teachers I remember from my time in school, aren't the ones who taught us the most complex subjects, aren't the ones who came down hard on us. Perhaps we do, but the one I remember the most are the ones who acted like role models, right? And so, for me, we're talking about children for a love of learning, to unlearn, relearn. If I don't see my teacher do that, how am I going to sort of mimic that, right? So for me, teachers play the role, have a role model to play. So if they tell the children, let's say, it's a female teacher, right? They say, look, I'm doing an extra course in coding, which I don't need to do, but I'm doing it. But I think that's where it's heading. You're sort of solving the whole gender thing for male and female. I think so. The whole lens of gender has to change in boys and girls. You've taught children that, look, I'm relearning even at my age. So at your age is very important. Yeah. So I think for me, fundamental thing to start off is acting as role models. See, how do I want my children to be, and what can I do today to change that? Teachers across the world will have different challenges. There'll be lack of internet devices. Of course, we've got to work within those constraints, but at least we can do what we can do, and that's what I would start with.
So becoming true role models and showing these skills in the way that we interact and teach children. Rani, is that what you believe we need to do, or are there other things we could be looking at?
Absolutely what we need to do. But one of the things that I would say is, for every teacher who's listening, find a community to be part of, and a community of like-minded teachers who are going through the challenges and finding answers, failing and learning and getting successful, so that as a community, we are leveraged in everybody's learnings. So, I spend quite a lot of time in what we call as Microsoft expert teachers, right? Innovative teachers. And the reason the program is called Microsoft Innovative Teachers is so that the focus is to be innovative. And by making innovation the priority, what that means is that you are going and finding new ways, you are problem solving very differently, and you are part of a community, so everybody's problem solving is adding value to you. And especially at this time, when the challenges are many. I remember having a conversation earlier with Vipul, and we said teachers are a bit like the shock absorbers, right? Before it gets to the student. So and we do that naturally. That's the passionate part of this industry. We do that naturally. So it's really important to be that shock absorber with many other shock absorbers, because that teaches us. So we have this thing that we focus on, which is the Microsoft Educator Community, where from having that social and emotional support with this community, all the way to how do we create lesson plans, how do we deal with children who are having some special needs, how to make sure that child is inclusive in the everyday things and in the small things that they do in classroom. So I think that community environment is really, really critical. We always say that, we need group work and we need to do all of this for the children. I say, teachers, take care of self. Get yourself into communities first, because on those days when you just don't have the energy while the rest of the system is catching up with us, we will have the energy with the community. And so that's one of the priorities that I would say that the teachers will want. And I'm very happy to be part of that community. And yeah, seek out those communities wherever they are. In Microsoft, that is the Microsoft Educator Community, but every technology provider has communities. Be part of one.
Thank you, Rani. Dima, what's your take on this?
Well, Rani and Vipul have covered pretty much everything. What I was also thinking of, I might add, is that I think because it starts with the teacher wanting that kind of change, wanting to have a different role, wanting to enjoy that different role of a facilitator, of a technology user, of a learner, of a partner, etc. It may be, I'm just assuming here, I'm making an assumption, no scientific background to what I'm saying, but those teachers who who are younger in age, who are into the generation and the generation of technology, etc., it's much easier for them to adapt to these new requirements. It's much easier for them to they have less fixedness back to the point of learning and unlearning and fixedness. So it may be easier for them. And what happens with teachers with 20 and 30 and 40 years of experience who are experts and great teachers the way the traditional education has been? I mean, how do we deal with those teachers? I think I'm posing a question here more than an answer.
But I think you're right. I mean, as the generation that grew up with digital technology all around them, gets into education and into running schools and ministries and so on, they will come with a vision that's different simply because they've been exposed to things from an early age that are different, and technology is not a source of fear, right? It's basically something that it's so natural for them, and that I think will change things. So I think what we've concluded on today is I think two really interesting things, and I think they are very good points. That yes, we all believe that there should be a world where technology is part of teaching and learning. We believe that over time curriculums will have to change, skills incorporated. We'll have to personalize learning, personalize assessment, and that things like artificial intelligence and other things will become an integral part of all of this. But that is going to take time because we have to train teachers, we have to change the assessment system, we have to redefine curricula. As Dima said, we have to look at the governance and frameworks, and all of those things will happen progressively. But in the meantime, we have I think three. I'll call them gems that we've picked up out of this. One is that whilst all of that is happening, we can all become role models, the teachers especially, around how we look at some of these skills, the interpersonal ones, the analytical ones, some of the digital ones, and teach learners through being role models, bearing in mind that they're not scared of technology as we may have been at the outset, and they're actually it's something that really engages them, and we've seen that. And also as Rani pointed out, become part of a community, create communities of like-minded teachers who are going to have the same goals, so that even whilst we're working within the constraints of the current system, what we're doing is making those incremental changes that give the learners the outcomes that we seek. And I think there's been a lot of comments about this, and I just want to say that my personal belief has always been that the purpose of education is to look after the well-being of the person through the entirety of their life, both in terms of becoming a responsible and inclusive part of society, but also in their economic well-being and fulfilling their ambitions and their potential. And that's how powerful it is, and that's what we need to make sure that it delivers. So I have to say it's been a wonderful discussion, and I'd like to again thank my esteemed panel. Thank you so much for being with us again. They've all been on before, and I was really grateful. Perhaps we were doing something right that they all came back on. But from London and the Department of International Trade, Vipul, from Microsoft, Rani, and from Injaz in Jordan, Dima, thank you so much, and lovely to have you on our webinar. For all of you, I've seen the comments going through, and I hope you got something out of this. The panel certainly saw your comments, and thank you so much for being an active part of our webinar. If you haven't registered, please register, because we will be sending out white papers and a feedback form so that we can take your ideas on board for the next one. We are planning another one towards the end of April, early May, so keep a lookout, and we will make sure that we email those of you on our database. And lastly, thank you to our sponsors, and if you wish to get in touch with any of them, please do contact us. Our contact details will be at the bottom of the screen, and both the website and email address. Feel free to get in touch. So thank you again, everybody, and I wish you all well. Stay safe, keep well, and until next time, See you soon. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.